Greetings and welcome to the Introduction to Astronomy. In this week's exploration of the solar system, we are going to talk about the Genesis spacecraft and what it helped us to better understand about our solar system. So, what is Genesis? Well, it was launched on August 8th of 2001 and was a planned sample return mission to collect samples and then bring those back to Earth for more detailed study. And in fact, those samples were going to be bits of the sun. Now, we can't collect the sun directly, but we can collect those particles that flow out into space. So this 3-year mission to collect particles from the solar wind and then to be able to determine the isotope concentrations. So isotopes are atoms with different numbers of neutrons. So carbon 1 is carbon 14. Typical carbon in our bodies is carbon 12, which is completely stable, has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. Carbon 14 has 6 protons and 8 neutrons and is unstable, and that decay allows us to study ages of various carbon-based materials here on Earth. Now, we can also look at things like the elemental abundances and study the composition of the sun and try to get any evidence that that may have changed. Now, this was sent on an unusual orbit, and let's take a look at that here. As we can see the orbit, it was sent out towards, in this case, towards the left-hand side in my image, to the L1 Lagrange point. And it was put in a circular orbit around that and designed to really be able to collect particles from the solar wind. Now, the detectors would have been deployed at this point and would have collected material over the course of years as material streams out from the sun and then is collected in the particle detectors, and then after its orbits were completed, it then returned to Earth, and you can see the return path there in the blue as it came around to land in Utah. Now, the idea originally was for it to be caught as it came down, that a helicopter would catch the descending spacecraft. And this had been planned and practiced. Unfortunately, it ended up crashing in the Utah desert because of a malfunction on the spacecraft where it did not slow down sufficiently, and therefore the helicopters were unable to do their maneuver to capture the spacecraft. Here we see it crashed into the Utah desert. However, at least some of the material survived and was able to be used. Other parts were destroyed or contaminated to a point where they then could not be used to study because we needed the pristine examples of the solar material. Now, what did we learn? Well, measurements verified that the composition of the sun has not changed in the last 100 million years or so at least. And we expect, because we know that the sun converts hydrogen to helium, but we also know that's all going on at its core. So the question would be, does any of that material get dredged up from the core and affect the surface composition? And this, at least in the last few 100 million years, the answer to this is a definite no. One thing that is noted is that oxygen-16 is depleted in the planets relative to the composition in the sun. So there are some differences in those isotopic observations that we want to study and want to learn about. The whole idea is the composition of the sun should be essentially unchanged from the origin of the solar system. That's what we would hope to find. So we're finding that pristine samples of material that would have been the stuff that made up the planets originally. So then the question would be, what has caused oxygen-16 to be depleted in the planets as compared to our sun? So let's go ahead and finish up here with our summary. And what we've looked at today is the Genesis spacecraft launched to collect solar wind particles and then return them to Earth. We get to learn about the early solar system composition and the material that originally made up the planets 4.5 billion years ago. Unfortunately, the sample return crashed, some was damaged, but at least some material was still collected and is able to be analyzed. So that concludes this discussion on the Genesis spacecraft. We'll be back again next week for another exploration of the solar system video. So until then, have a great day, everyone, and I will see you in class.